For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Moreover, man was not created because of woman, but woman because of man. For this reason, a woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head, that is, properly arranged hair, because of the angels. However, in the Lord, woman does not have priority over man, nor does man have priority over woman. For just as women are begotten by men, so men are birthed by women. But everything comes from God. 1 Corinthians 11, 8-12. This passage clearly affirms what we have suggested, namely, that there are two ways of looking at this issue, which are only superficially contradictory. Creation teaches both principles that Paul outlines. 1. The precedence of Adam in the order of creation. 2. The equality of men and women before God. It is important to note that it is only after the fall that this precedence in the creation order has authority connotations, because the authority relationship in marriage is a result of the fall and the judgments of Genesis, chapter 3. In the passage quoted, Paul switches the order in which these two principles are treated in Genesis 1:26 and 27. He first reproves the Corinthian woman for tearing and disheveling their hair in mourning after the pagan manner, a practice that shames our hope in the resurrection. Using the priority of creation as an argument for their obedience on this point, Paul argues that such a practice dishonors their husbands by effacing the symbol of respect they are due by this priority of creation. However, having established the obligation for the Corinthian women to respond to their husband's authority on this point of abuse, he is quick to anticipate the false conclusion that men are somehow better than women in the eyes of God. In truth, he tells us, we are all equal in the Lord, with absolutely no advantage accruing to the male gender, nor any disadvantage to the female gender. This lesson, too, Paul reminds us, is taught by the natural order of creation. Since neither men nor women can exist without the other, it stands to reason that God does not place a premium on either gender. And in fact, all things originate from the creative hand of God, so that neither gender has any grounds for boasting. All of us are subordinate to God's authority. This last point, that everything comes from God, is the most crucial. Whatever authority a husband has over a wife, an employer over an employee, a government official over a citizen, a pastor over a member of his congregation, all these forms of authority have been delegated by God for his own wise and sovereign purposes. And it is well to remember that there is no man, no woman who is not subject to many forms of God's delegated authority as long as he or she be in this present body. The predominant reason for the current distinction in authority between the sexes is the marriage relationship and the obligations it places upon both parties. But in eternity, there will be no marrying nor giving in marriage. Matthew 22:30. The present status quo of authority distinctions in the institution of marriage will not obtain in eternity, where there will be no corruption and no marriage. The relationship between the first husband and wife in Eden, however, occupies a middle ground between our present circumstances and our future hope. There was marriage in paradise, and certain central points of the marriage relationship continue today as they were in the beginning. Matthew 19:3-9. But the specific delineation of the husband's authority over the wife which we find, stated in principle in Genesis chapter 3, and spelled out in detail in the New Testament epistles, Ephesians 5:21-33 and Colossians 3:18 and 19, was apparently lacking for the simplest of all possible reasons. It was unnecessary. Status quo in paradise. Eden, whose very name means delight in Hebrew, was a place of perfection. Nothing was lacking that could contribute to man's legitimate happiness, nor was anything present that might make life bitter. God placed Adam in charge of the garden, making him God's delegated authority, God's regent on earth. Genesis 1:26-30. The duties that fell to Adam's lot as a result of God's charge seem to have been entirely satisfying and enjoyable, while at the same time none too taxing or onerous. The garden was irrigated by a system of rivers and mist, specially constructed by the Lord. Genesis 2:6, 10-14. The trees brought forth a pleasant variety of sustenance, pleasing to the sight and enjoyable for eating, apart from any horticultural care. Genesis 2:9. Boredom was not a problem, for God provided satisfying intellectual and physical labor, such as the classification and categorization of the complex and intricate system of flora and fauna he had created. Genesis 2:19 and 20. Nor was spiritual sustenance lacking, for the Lord placed in the center of the garden the tree of life for spiritual refreshment. Genesis 2:9 with Revelation 22:2, and visited our first parents for spiritual fellowship after their working day was done. Genesis 3:8. The one want Adam had, God remedied almost immediately, that is, his need for companionship. The elimination of this deficiency is, after all, God's stated reason for creating Eve. It is not a good thing for the man to be alone. Genesis 2:18. Obviously, the Lord was aware of this fact before he created Adam, a point emphasized by the mandate in Genesis 1:28 to be fruitful and multiply. But Adam was a human being, the exact same divine mix of body and spirit that each one of us are, so that God did not deem it appropriate merely to supply him with a mate in the manner of animals. Adam is instead allowed to discover his need for companionship through a heuristic process of observation, Genesis 2:19 and 20, with the result that he can appreciate both his own need and God's gracious gift of Eve to him, Genesis 2:23. I will make for him a helper compatible with him. Genesis 2:18. This verse is crucial to our understanding of the point we are now discussing, namely that things were different in the garden. Eve is not to be a servant, but literally a help, Hebrew Ezer. Secondly and critically, she is to be someone who corresponds to him, Hebrew Senegdo, that is, someone who complements and fulfills him in all compatibility. The closeness and intimacy of the relationship between our first parents foreshadowed in this verse is underscored by Eve's creation. The Lord's formation of Eve's body from one of Adam's ribs adds the physical dimension to the spiritual one outlined in Genesis 2:18. In short, it would have been impossible for Adam and Eve to have been any closer, body and spirit, and still have been two distinct people. When the Lord presents to Adam this wife who was in every way an answer to his search for companionship, his words bespeak not only gratitude, but an appreciation for this God-given relationship of exceptional intimacy and closeness. And Adam said, "This now is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. She shall be called woman, because from man she was taken." Genesis 2:23. Ideally, based on the pattern in paradise, the marriage relationship should even now continue to be what it was then, even closer than the next closest of all other human relationships, the parent-child relationship. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, for the two will become a single body. Genesis 2:24. Scripture, then, while emphasizing the closeness of the union between Adam and Eve, does not provide many specifics on the issue of authority between the first man and woman prior to the fall. We know that Adam was created first, and that Eve was created for Adam, not the other way around. However, neither the Genesis account nor the New Testament references intimate an authority structure between husband and wife similar to the one instituted in Genesis chapter 3 by the Lord as a result of the fall of that first couple, Genesis 3:16. The reason for this absence, as we have suggested, is that such an authority structure was unnecessary in paradise. For instance, Adam and Eve had no monetary and no sexual problems. Given the extremely high percentage of marital difficulties today attributable to these two factors alone, one can appreciate immediately that this first marriage was operating on a much different battlefield than every marriage since. Furthermore, and perhaps more to the point, our first parents were sinless before they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Neither Adam nor Eve was initially capable of being selfish or hurtful, self-centered or insensitive. The garden was a world full of intriguing possibilities, all of them perfectly legitimate, with one exception. As long as our first parents abstained from the forbidden fruit, nothing was withheld from them, nothing was lacking for them, no personal ambition or desire that they could in innocence conceive was denied them. In short, there was essentially no area where authority might even have any opportunity to function between the first man and the first woman, for it was completely unnecessary. There was no occasion for Eve's will to bump into Adam's, because there was nothing that Adam could or would tell Eve to do or not to do, even if such a thing had occurred to him or to her, and that is doubtful given their innocence and their perfect surroundings. Indeed, the only negative prohibition was the command to abstain from eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and this command came from God himself and was equally applicable to both Adam and Eve. As long as they both followed God's will on this point, marital problems were an impossibility, and therefore the issue of who was in charge was an entirely moot point.